just so that we don't have interference. So at the end of the program, we'll be taking questions. So if you want to ask a question, you are welcome to either put that question in the chat, or when we open the floor for questions for Scott, you can just unmute yourself or raise your hand if you would like to have the opportunity to ask a question. I also recommend up in the top right on most of your computers, there's the opportunity to change between gallery view and speaker view. And for this program, I'm going to recommend that you put that in speaker view. I do thank you guys all for joining us, and I especially thank Scott for trying this program with us. We're very excited to have him, and he's learning Zoom, as we all have been for the last couple of months. So we'll have some people continuing to jump on, but we're going to go ahead and get started. I would like to also let you know that we'll be streaming this program live on Facebook on our Glore Psychiatric Museum website. So if you have people who you want to share the program with, you can let them know that they can go to our Facebook page to see the program. My name is Sarah Wilson. I'm the Executive Director of the St. Joseph Museums, and the Glore Psychiatric Museum is one of our sites. And Scott Clark has been gracious enough to agree to give us a program on the Glore, and this is super special for a number of reasons. First, Scott has worked for the Missouri State Hospital System for a number of years, for a long time in St. Joseph, or probably most of his career in St. Joseph. But he also worked with George Glore, who was the founder of the Glore Psychiatric Museum. And when George retired, Scott took over as the director of the Glore Psychiatric Museum, and he helped put together the museum in its current location. So it was originally in the Center Building at the State Hospital, or for many years it was at the Center Building, and Scott was instrumental in helping that move from that location to our current location. So without further ado, I would like to have Scott jump on and say a few words. And in the meantime, I'm going to be sharing his presentation so he can work through that. But thank you all for joining us. And Scott, thank you so much. I owe you big time for coming and sharing your many years of knowledge with us.
Well, let's just see how this ends. Anyway. Thank you, Sarah. I had the good fortune of not only working for the State Hospital for the past 28 years, but I spent 10 years as the Glore Psychiatric Museum curator. I did get to work with George. I was just amazed that somebody like George would take the time to support me. Now, he was getting a little sick. He was getting retirement age. His health issues got him to the point where he really had to retire. But it was amazing to me, with everybody that I talked to, not only in the state of Missouri, but nationwide, everybody knew of George. What he did was put together probably, arguably, the best single collection of items that kind of chronicled how mental health care has evolved over the years. What I'm going to do with today's presentation is, well, I just lost you, Sarah. Are you there? Should we try it again?
Doing just fine, and we can hear you just fine. You may want to scoot a little bit closer to your computer.
Okay, well, the screen just went black. That's what I was worried about. Okay. Anyway, a lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in here are part of the collections of the Glore Museum, but I also was able to find just a lot of really, from a historical standpoint, just really neat stuff. That's what makes being a museum person so much good, or so much fun. Okay, Sarah, let's go ahead. Can you move to there you go. Before 1800, there absolutely was not a whole lot of treatment going on. Dr. Benjamin Rush, who is considered the father of American psychiatric care, he was a friend of Thomas Jefferson's. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He it's suspected that he wrote a lot of the Federalist Papers in support of the Constitution. Just a really, really all-around neat guy. He advised Lewis and Clark before they went up creek because he wanted not only for Lewis to be able to take care of the Corps of Discovery, but he also wanted them to take as much notes to see how the Native Americans were treating people, how they're staying healthy, and when there were issues, how they took care of it. In spite of all of that, let me go back a step. Dr. Rush wrote a book in 1804 called Observations of the Mind Diseased, and it was the first one. There was just nothing else out there where people had actually looked and tried to figure out why mental illness was there, and once they did identify it, how to treat that. Next slide, Sarah. In spite of as progressive and as enlightening as he was, Dr. Rush figured the best way to treat people was to restrain them to a chair for as much as 6 months. And the one on the right is a drawing of his original design. The one on the left is his original design. The one on the right is George Glore found a replica in upstate New York and copied it, had our carpentry shop build that one there. The people would be strapped to it for as much as 6 months. They would pour fluids over their head to kind of calm them down or to shock them back to reality. They could bleed them or leech them. There were other things that they could do to them while they were strapped there, and that's why you see the bucket in the chair too, because that 6 months was an awfully long 6 months. The hood over it was primarily designed just so they would be distracted by other things going on in the room. I'd been with the museum about 4 years and started hearing that the state of New York was closing a lot of their state hospitals, and they had all this neat stuff that they were trying to decide what they were going to do with it. Among those were some of the original Dr. Rush's chairs. I begged and whined and pleaded and tried to get one for us, and they said no, they didn't want to put it out. They didn't want to display. They didn't want to store it, but they sure as heck didn't want to display it. I guess they thought that if people saw how they treated patients way back when, that it would make the Department of Mental Health in New York look really, really bad. Unfortunately, that was kind of typical for the treatment that we did have back then. Okay, Sarah. Some of the other, Dorothea Dix is another crusader. Dorothea started out in upstate in New England. She ran Bible studies and church services in the prisons and the jails in the Northeast U.S. The wardens would allow her and her friends to see all of the murderers and rapists and killers and all that good stuff. But there was a part of the jails or the prisons that they never let her into. And when she finally snuck back there, she found that the people were poorly clothed. The food was just rancid and all sorts of gunk on it. They had no blankets. And this was where all the mentally ill people stayed. She finally browbeat the wardens and allowed her to start bringing in better food and blankets and clothing and stuff like that. It started a huge career for her. She traveled all over the world. Eventually, she came to Missouri in 1847. The legislature was about to open a state hospital here at Fulton, and they wanted to make sure that they did it right. So they invited Dorothea and her cohorts to come to Missouri. That was really the impetus for how the Missouri Department of Mental Health was founded and how our treatment programs evolved from then. Fulton was the first hospital. We decided that, I say we, the royal we, decided that we needed more than one hospital. You can go ahead, Sarah. We needed more than one hospital in Missouri. And so the governor at the time was Silas Woodson, who actually lived on the grounds where the new Northwest Missouri Psych Rehab Center is. But he was governor for 3 years, from 73 to 75. They had talked about putting a new state hospital in the western half of the state, and it was kind of evolving between St. Joseph, Kansas City, and Nevada. Fortunately, since the governor was the governor, he had 110 or 15 acres that he could spare. He sold that to the state, and that's when the St. Joseph State Hospital was formed. Legislation was passed in 1872. The building was opened in 1874, and it was amazing to me how enlightened we were compared to the rest of the United States. but still looking back on it, it really wasn't a whole lot of help. Go ahead, Sarah. One of the popular treatments at the time was phrenology. And the only reason I throw it in here, because I really like phrenology, is it's kind of you look back at it and say, man, how could they have done that? Well, that's really kind of innocuous when it came to treatment back then. But there was a couple Austrian brothers by the name of Franz Joseph Gall, and I can't think of his brother, and there was a couple American doctors who kind of adopted this and promoted it. They thought that they could predict mental health, behavioral, things like that by measuring your scalp and comparing it to 27 known areas on a known scale here in the faculties. They also theorized that if you had the physical features of an animal, you would have the personality of that animal. So if you were kind of hoggish, you look like that way. If you had the big flowing beard and the hair, you were more of a lion, and things like that. They also theorized that they could predict who your logical spouse would be, just comparing your phrenology with their phrenology, and I've never figured that part out yet. Go ahead. This is us, State Lunatic Asylum number 2, opened November the 4th of 1874, November 9th, 1874. Lunatic had kind of a different meaning back then. The asylum part held true. It was a place to go and rest, to get away from the world and just kind of collect your thoughts and all that stuff. There were hospitals back east for inebriates and imbeciles. I mean, that was how they were titled. This original building was set up so that there would be about 250 beds. I don't think they got much over 210, 212. The patients lived on the 4 wings on both sides, north and south. The staff lived in the middle part there. This building was designed by architect out of St. Louis, and I could have told you his name a few minutes ago. But anyway, there was a doctor, go ahead to the next slide. There was a doctor back east named Thomas Story Kirkbride, who theorized that we needed the big, well, okay, I'll get to that in a minute. First things first. Our original superintendent was Dr. George Catlett. Dr. Catlett was kind of an interesting person. He served in the Civil War, was captured, was taken to a prisoner of war camp in Louisiana as a physician. They had a yellow fever outbreak down there that was just everybody was dying from, and he and 2 or 3 other doctors got in there and were able to put the pandemic down, to coin a phrase. And so they turned him loose and let him come back to St. Joe. Dr. Catlett was well known as a student of the brain, of the mental illnesses. And when he was, for his dedication remarks for the hospital, he said that this facility was to be consecrated for all time to the noble work of reviving hope in the human heart and dispelling the portentous clouds that envelop and penetrate the intellects of mind diseased. We're kind of still doing that. Maybe not as flowery, but we're still kind of doing that. One other thing I'll just add, I tend to digress a lot too, so you just forgive me on that. Dr. Catlett chaired the autopsy commission when Jesse James died. It was kind of, I read the autopsy. It was kind of funny because they knew that Jesse's mom, Zerelda, was just a real, I can't even think of a good, nice word to call her, but she was very outspoken. And so they didn't want to desecrate the body. Usually when you autopsy somebody, you cut the scalp off from the top, you cap the skull, so you cut the bone and then you pull the brain out, put it aside, look at the brain, determine if there's anything there. And yes, there were bullets in his brain. But when they heard that Jesse's stepbrother John was coming to pick him up, they thought they better put him back together. Now, what they had done was they actually cut him up the back of his head, cut the skin and separated the skin in the back of his head to open it up and just pulled the skin away from his face. So when they put him back together, they put the skull back on there at the top of the skull. They put the back up, they sewed it together, put him in the basket so John could take him home. Unfortunately, in their haste to get him presentable, they forgot to put the brain back in his skull. And the autopsy is very clear about how they were really starting to panic because they couldn't find it. They didn't know where it had gone and stuff like that. One of my jobs as we were moving to the new building across the street was to go through all the old buildings and look at all the storage areas and closets and everything else to see if there was anything we needed for the museum. I looked for that darn brain for about 3 solid weeks and never did find it. So I'd really like to know what happened to Jesse James' brain. But anyway, that's another story. Okay, go ahead, Sarah. There's Jesse. Go ahead to the next slide. Thomas Story Kirkbride was the superintendent of the Pennsylvania State Psychiatric Hospital back in, as you see, the early 1800s. He theorized that our patients needed the big, massive red brick buildings with a lot of windows, so fresh air would be blowing through. But he thought that would provide the grounding that they would need. That was the stabilizing factor. Some of his other theories were that we needed, if a patient had a work skill, they should be expected to provide those skills. If they farm, they worked on our farm. If they made shoes and boots, that they would be boot black, that kind of stuff. It was just amazing to me that so many different hospitals adopted his theories and put them to good use. And that's basically what Fulton Hospital was and what ours. In fact, all of the Missouri hospitals at one time were all built under the Kirkbride design. Next slide. One of the signature features of the Kirkbride design was the openness, not only the downstairs, the main staircase, but the staircase went all the way to the 4th floor. Usually a huge skylight, a bell tower, or something like that up on top of the building. For several years, my office was on the 4th floor. We had a skylight up there. We could grow house plants like you wouldn't believe. It was just amazing. The old buildings tended to house bats too, so every now and then a bat would come out and from the storage areas. Yeah, that was not one of the nicer things. But you can kind of see what this looks like. Now, as we moved across the street into the brand new building, Department of Corrections had no need for that staircase there. So we were able to get most of that. And if you ever visit the museum on the 1st floor, when you get in down by the conference room, you'll see a portion of the stairs we were able to put together there. We actually have pretty much up to the 2nd floor of the stairs. Would love to have had time or place where we could rebuild that. But failing that, all right, you can go on. In 1879, in January of 1879, we had a huge fire. When the building was rebuilt, this is what it looked like. So instead of just having the wings north and south, we had, eventually there were 4 wings to the south and 3 wings to the north. You see the carriage right down there in front. That was known as Asylum Road there. It's the Frederick Avenue. That's where it is now. Times have changed. The irony, and I have looked for years for something to illustrate it, but with all the westward migration and things like that, the wagon trains were backed up all the way basically out to our facility, waiting for their time on the ferry boats to get across the river to get over into Kansas. I would just love to have had a picture of what that looked like. But you can see this is the Thomas Story Kirkbride, Dr. Kirkbride's design. The other buildings we had after this were all fairly complete. They didn't attach, although I'll get to that in just a minute. But basically, you can see what this place looked like. It took about a year to rebuild. They made over 1 million bricks. There was a clay pit on the south end of the grounds, and they were able to get enough clay out to make the 1 million+ bricks. When the fire hit, everybody just took off in 300 different directions. It was amazing how they were able to get most of the guys and gals back. Most of them went home for that year while it was being rebuilt. There was a wooden shelter built in front of the facility, and that's where most of the men stayed. What women that they could not find housing for were actually kept in the basement of the courthouse. There was a renovation done to the courthouse, 30 years ago, I'm going to guess, and they still found the steel rings attached to the walls down there. So they're kind of a throwback to when our patients were held down there. All right, next slide. We are always led to believe that the wards we have were just, people were out of control, they were drooling, and those that wore clothes were, really torn up and all this stuff, a lot of fighting and all this stuff. And yet a lot of the photos that we have from that time period shows that in this case, the men are very well behaved. They're all sitting there with their waistcoats on and their cravats. And this is the recreation area on that particular ward, men's ward is what it was called. It's amazing to me that in spite of all of this, if we had visitors or politicians or somebody else come through, we'd always show them the front wards. Never showed them the back wards. And the back wards where all the people were just out of control. There was a gal by the name of Dr. Jane English, who was the second woman to graduate from the University of Missouri Medical School in 1902. She was in general practice out in Colorado, I think. But at some point, she heard that the state of Missouri was looking for a physician for our hospital here. And she figured, well, why not just take the train ride? If nothing else, she'd come back and visit friends and at least get a free ride out of it. She, when she got there, she talked about how well behaved all the patients were, how clean and neat the wards were. And she kind of attributed that to the fact that the nurses that ran those wards just kind of ran with an iron fist. The letters from Dr. Jane were actually to a nephew of hers that she was trying to convince to get into the physician's field. Go ahead. This is the women's wards, and you can see similarly, they are very well behaved. If you notice the rocking chairs here, there's rocking chairs up on the top floor of the museum, and it shows the progression of how small our patients were way back when, because we've got one of the original rocking chairs there. But you see how small the rocking chairs were compared to what you might have in your house right now. But here again, you can see how well behaved the patients were there. Go ahead. Every afternoon we go for a walk. Girls in the front, guys in the back. Why they just didn't take off and run, I have no idea. But it seemed that fresh air and exercise was a major component for the patients we had here. Go to the next slide. From the men's standpoint, there was a fenced-in area just right off of Frederick that kind of ran up to where the parking lot for the center building was. But you can see again how well dressed these guys are, how reasonably clean they look. They're wearing their waistcoats. They either have ties or cravats on. There's gliders. There's benches. There was horseshoe pits. There was croquet games there. There were also tables for chess and checkers. And here again, you can just see how important it seemed to be that they have a lot of fresh air. Go ahead. Our third superintendent was Dr. Charles Woodson. He was the nephew of the governor. Dr. Woodson was here about 8-9 years. He believed in teaching our staff how to do their job. It's talked about here as a class of nurses. We still have employee orientation, and we still talk not so much about the nursing side of it, but at least about what the care is, what's specific to our facility. Dr. Woodson left us in 1908. I think there's one more slide with him. Go ahead. But while he was here, he was known for some of the improvements that he made and the demands for new buildings and facilities, because he wanted not only for the patients to be well taken care of, but he wanted the staff to be too. Again, there were staff apartments in the main building. 2 nurses here. You can see what it looked like for them. I had a list I was trying to find, but there's a description of what was expected of the nurses. And part of that was, of course, to keep the wards clean, but they were also expected to first thing in the morning be on their ward by 7 o'clock to change out all the buckets and the other things to make sure there's enough coil oil for the lamps. They worked 12-hour shifts. If they took care of their patients and were well behaved enough and all this stuff, if after 3 years they would get a nickel raise. So that just shows how progressive Dr. Woodson was back then. Go ahead. Staffing, You notice the nurses in the background with the I can't think of it. Well, anyway, the not camisoles. What am I thinking of? Anyway, some of them have an armband on it says that 2. We were state hospital number 2. Nevada was number 3. Farmington was number 4. The St. Louis State Hospital was actually the county facility in St. Louis first, and then during World War II, it joined the state facilities. But you can see the nurses there, the guys in the white coats off on the left-hand side, they were the attendants. The guys sitting in front here were the officers, and those were all the docs. There was a newspaper article in 1901 that said something to the effect of how the railroad police and the local detectives found 9 homeless people down in the rail yards, hauled them off to jail. The next day they went before the judge, and the judge says, okay, you've got your choice. You can either stay in jail for the next 10 days, or you can go out to work at number 2. Well, they all chose jail. They didn't want to come out here to work, which was, we still have staffing problems, but not quite like that. Go ahead, Sarah. This is the detached women's wards. We think about the state hospital being strictly a psychiatric or a mental illness thing. It's amazing to me that that was just a part of it. When they said it was a state hospital, it was that. It was a hospital. Some of the typical admission diagnosis was epilepsy, religious excitement, disappointment in love, meningitis, inebriety, injury, injury from a fall, grief, overwork, opium habits, spinal irritation, heredity, mumps, and puerperal state, which is basically the postpartum thing. We had a lot of tuberculosis patients here. We had a lot of yellow fever and things like that. This women's wards was more for the healthcare side of it, because we felt that was something that was necessary. When we first opened up, even until actually when I was here, if one of your relatives was just not quite right, or they were perpetually sick or something like that, you just bring them out to us. Just drop them off at our front door. We tell you to bring the clothes you want them buried in, because chances are they weren't going to leave. And there is a cemetery on the southeast corner of the correctional facility. I'll get on that in just a minute here. But we had enough demand that we had to build one whole ward for just the women's health care. Eventually, there was another building. I can't remember if I put that slide in, but it was the men's detached ward. And they called it detached because it wasn't part of the original, the wings going north and south. Go ahead. I think there's a slide showing the inside of the wards. Yeah, this is the women's wards. And it can be just for a variety of reasons. In 1881, we had a woman who was admitted to the hospital, married young, had 5 kids over her lifetime, wasn't homicidal, suicidal, anything like that. The problem was she'd just take off her clothes and walk around in the rain. Now, her diagnosis, according to the doctor that admitted her, was that she was chronic insanity caused by excessive childbearing. I have 4 kids. I used to blame them all the time because I knew exactly what that gal felt like. But that's another story. So go ahead. One of Dr. Kirkbride's theories was, again, that if our patients had skills, they would put those skills to work. As a result, we raised almost all of our own food. Just a quick aside here, the guys with ties on our staff, the other guys are patients that were here. We raised nearly all the food we consumed. We had hog and cattle and dairy farms, year-round meat, dairy products. Hospital farms also provided grain for bread, livestock feed, vegetables. Orchards provided various fruits and nuts. One of the early superintendent's reports noted the hospital farms produced beets, cabbage, parsnips, 69 bushels of rhubarb, turnips, 67 gallons of berries, 24,600 hogs, and tobacco. We also had an ice house, a huge pond about where the cemetery is now, but the pond was there. They would cut ice out of it throughout the cold months so that we could not only keep the food cold, but occasionally when one of our patients would die and they weren't going to be buried in our cemetery, family would want to take them home. Well, we'd put them on ice for however long it took for the family to get here. I'm amazed that one of Dr. Woodson's reports showed that they got, I don't know, $35,000 in appropriations from the state of Missouri, but they were so self-sufficient, they were able to send like 27,000 of that back. They didn't have to use it because we did everything else here. Go ahead, Sarah. We actually farmed into the 50s. We know that where the Northwest Psych Rehab Center is now on the north side of Frederick, between UCP and high school, that was the second portion of land that we acquired. And as you can see, we farmed it a lot. Where the Young Gull Conservation Area is and Hilliard Votech, that was also part of our farm. We had 110 acres in the old historic building. We had 115 acres where we are now, and the Hilliard and the Young Gull are about that amount there. We also had grain farms north and south of town. One was off of Pickett Road, past what is Riverside now. The other one was up near Helena, and we raised a lot of grains and veggies there. There was a mule barn just south of our administrative building, the center building, and it was on the state historic register for a long time. You can see here what the hospital looked like in 1922, I think. But what they did was they filled in the porches, they screened in the porches. That was the superintendent's apartment there. I met a woman who was raised here at our hospital, and she used to talk about how the patients would cook for them and do housekeeping and do the sewing and everything else. It was just amazing how supportive the patients were of the staff here. You can also see the gingerbread up on top again, which is part of what Dr. Kirkbride. And that one dormer right there on the right-hand side, that's where my office was for a while. Go ahead. The Panettiere Hospital is actually the 3-story building that's right across the drive from the Glore Museum. This hospital was our surgical hospital. It opened in 1913. Dr. A.H. Panettiere was the main physician there. And they named the building for him because, again, as far as being a self-contained operation, we handled all the healthcare needs for our patients too. But anyway, Dr. Panettiere was killed in World War II. And so they named this building for him. At one point in World War II, all of our doctors went off to serve. So we left it for volunteers from the community and other people that would just happen to be riding through town, I'm going to guess. But that hospital dates back at least till then. Go ahead. Some of the common treatment processes this time starting in about the 30s and going through the 50s were the wet sheet packs. We'd actually strap somebody down to a bed and take ice packs, put it on the patients, and the body temperature would cause the ice to melt. And when it did, the body would flow, or the ice would flow across the folks. And it was just supposed to be a very calming type thing. This is one of our docs here who wanted to see what it was like. So he guinea pigged it up and was able to see what it was like. Go ahead. Hydrotherapy was very common. We had the needle showers on the left. On the right-hand side, we had the big brick thing there, and you would have 2 faucets on it, and you would shoot a stream of hot water, alternated with cold water, and back to hot water, and that was supposed to just calm folks down. Go ahead. When George came to work here, this rocking chair therapy was one of the common treatment devices. Patients would sit in the rocking chairs, and they just sit there and rock and rock and rock. Kept them busy and quiet all day long. Twice a day, the staff would walk out on the ward with a hose everybody down, throw them clean clothes or dry clothes, and tell them to get back in the rocking chairs into bed. You can see the beds they're like 3 layers away from the walls, and that actually went all the way around. That building is still standing on Frederick. There were 150 beds in that building and only 2 staff. Not a whole lot of treatment going on. These rocking chairs are called the Fulton rocker, designed at Fulton State Hospital. You can rock those cotton pickers and they will never tip. So we never had any worries. I say the staff never had any worries about people falling out and getting hurt because those things just rock and rock and rock. Go ahead. Go ahead, Sarah. There it is. One of the darker stories, and one that I can't say that we were not embarrassed or not proud of, but there was a young man in Cavendish, Vermont in 1837. Phineas Gage was his name, and he was helping build a railroad. His job was to blow up the rocks or blow the hillsides apart so that they could build the railroads. So he drilled a hole, put a couple sticks of dynamite in, tap it down with a big steel rod, put a couple more sticks of dynamite in. Apparently that caused a spark. The explosives went off. That steel rod came flying out the hole, entered his left cheek, exited right above his right eye, and landed on how far away. Picked himself up, signed out in the book that day so he'd get paid, and either walked or rode to town, again, depending on whose story you believe. He lived for 13 years, but his personality changed. Before the accident, he was a hardworking, God-fearing family man. Afterwards, he cussed, he got divorced, he couldn't hold a job, just a variety, just a really, really jerk. Egas Moniz, a Portuguese neurologist here, decided, if you can take a really nice guy and destroy part of the frontal part of the brain and calm him down, maybe we could take the really out of control people, do the same type of surgery, as it were, and calm them down. Dr. Moniz got the Nobel Prize for surgery because it was just that progressive, just that unique. They got good results. I'm not saying that it was all good, but they got just enough to keep doing it. Basically, what they would do is they would drill 2 holes into the skull, take a steel pin called a leucotone, and move it back and forth in the prefrontal part, the personality part of the brain, and mush it up. And by doing so, they calm the folks down. Now, again, we look at this now and say, man, that's barbaric. How could they do that? Well, again, at the time, they got just enough good results from it to figure that they needed to try it. Egas and his crew could do 4 of those an hour. Patient was generally awake the whole time they were doing it. They drilled holes in the skull. Now they would have, because once you got past the skin, the brain couldn't feel pain. But again, they were just very proficient at what they did. Go to the next slide, Sarah. There's a couple of American doctors who thought there had to be a faster and better way to do it. Walter Freeman and his partner, Jim Watts, they were practicing in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown University. They figured there had to be a faster and better way to do it. So they practiced on cadavers and dogs for a while. Finally, in 1963, I think it was. No, it couldn't be that late. Before that, anyway, the first human person they did to was a 60-year-old woman from Topeka, Kansas, who just happened to be in Washington, D.C. at the wrong time. Family said she was out of control. She really wasn't very sociable. She was just very excitable all the time. So Freeman and Watts did their lobotomies, the transorbital. And what they did was they took this ice pick and they would put it right at the tear duct and use the hammer to ram that into the brain. And they move it up and down and back and forth. They switch over and do it on the opposite side. If, in fact, they didn't think they were getting enough good service that way, they would go up through the nose and do the same thing. A lot of people thought that Freeman should have gotten the Nobel Prize along with Moniz, but that didn't happen. Again, we look at this now and say that is just absolutely barbaric. But who's to say that 50 years from now, they won't say some of the medications we're using or some of the other treatment devices we're using now isn't just as bad. Now, they traveled around, Freeman and Watts, they traveled around. There's a book called Great and Desperate Cures. Valentine is the author of it. And he was able to track where they had been and who they'd seen and how many lobotomies they had done. But they would go out and teach the local docs how to do this. They were in St. Joe. They were here about 3 months, did 111 lobotomies while they were here. Again, got just enough good results to keep doing it. There's a lot of famous people that were lobotomized by their family members just to get them to calm down, or just they weren't as well behaved as they could have been, they thought. That being said, at some point, Jim Watts decided this wasn't for him and he needed to just back away from it. So Freeman kept going. Now, there was a junior college at St. Joe Junior College had a psychologist, a PhD psychologist. Mary Frances Robinson was her name. Go ahead to the next slide. Mary Frances Robinson traveled with Freeman and did pre and post psychological tests on the patients and found there wasn't a whole lot of change. Well, if there wasn't a whole lot of change, why do you keep doing it? Great point. Based on her research, and Freeman also contributed to the research. They authored a lot of journal articles. They wrote a couple books. But basically, the state of Missouri, since it showed that it really didn't do a whole lot of help or didn't give continually a whole lot of help, state of Missouri quit doing this in 1952. Freeman continued doing it until 1972 when he died. But again, we look at this now and that's just unbelievable. And I really don't have any way to defend it. I don't have any way to really argue for it or anything. Yes, they got good results, but they didn't get as much good results as you would think. Go ahead. This is what our hospital looked like in 49 and 50, so it's post-World War II. Frederick Avenue is running through the upper back there. The new hospital is over in that farm field. You can see there was an orphanage where LeBlond is now. That's why the Catholic Church built the high school there, because they already own the ground. Part of the philosophy was in building a hospital this far from town. We were 2.5 miles from downtown. So genteel society didn't want to have state hospitals or orphanages or anything like that closer to them. So they thought this would be just about as far out as they needed to go. But you can see how spread out the various buildings were. In the middle is the center building. You can see the 4 wings to the north and the 3 to the south. You can see the detached women's and men's wards there. The X-looking building back over on the right-hand side was built in 1937. It's called the Park Building, named after our governor at the time, Guy Park. The Panettiere Hospital is right behind that. You can see what the 3-story building there. And then the receiving unit is what the Woodson's Children's Hospital became. But the receiving unit also had a detox component there, substance abuse. You can't see too well, but down in the lower half of the lower part of the picture, there's a hog and dairy farm there. Again, we did everything. Just to the right of that, there were some chicken coops. And that little open field down there that you see, that's where the cemetery is. It actually starts in the woods to the right of that. But after they filled up all that ground with graves and they moved over to the open place. Go ahead, Sarah. George Glore was a 41-year employee with the state of Missouri with the Department of Mental Health. He was born and raised down in southeast Missouri, so went to work at the Farmington State Hospital down there, number 4. Eventually transferred to Fulton Hospital and then moved up here as an occupational therapist. The occupational therapy department also handled the internal and external communications, the public relations for the facility. They had a lot of, they called it museum and special projects. So if there were dinners or if there was staff reunions or retirement programs, whatever it was, his department is the one that took care of it. He founded the museum in 1968. He had some replicas built for Mental Health Awareness Week, and I'll show you those in just a minute, at East Hills. It went over so well that Dr. O'Brien, the superintendent at the time, asked him why didn't he see what he could find, what else he could find to help make the museum. That's how this museum got started. In '97, we moved to the new facility across the street. Department of Corrections took over everything behind the museum, and that's that building. What's the museum right now was the med-surg building. We had operations suites up on the top floor. There was a morgue downstairs. There was all sorts of lab work and stuff like that. They were still using that, the lab, and the pharmacy was there when I came to work here. Go ahead. These are a couple, well, the one down below is the Utica Crib. Again, that's another New York State treatment device, but it was used pretty much all over the country in various ways and forms. Basically, you would put as many as 3 people in that thing. You put some straw down, but you put as many as 3 people in there at once, keep them there for approximately a week. I mean, if your bunkmates were incontinent or just still out of control, can you imagine what that would have done to your health? The big wooden crib up in the upper right-hand corner, we were on Ripley's, believe it or not, back in 2000, and there was a doctor from Ohio that had seen that. And apparently when he had worked at a psychiatric hospital in Columbus, they had a lot of those types of cribs. You could put as many as 6 people in there at once. Now they would be crunched in a fetal position or something like that. But the idea being just to keep them quiet, keep them out of the way. Now, I don't know what that would have done if I was one of those 6. It would have just been really out of control. Again, George had so that's a real crib. The one down on the lower left was one that George had built. Go ahead, Sarah. The hollow wheel stood as much as 9 foot tall. The out of control patients were allowed to get in there and run and do anything else they wanted to, or they could just sit there and be very quiet. There were drawings that we used to see or used to have of a big steel crank out on the outside of that thing, and staff would actually crank that and force the folks to run. The bath of surprise on the right-hand side, if somebody was out of control, you put them in some sort of restraints or straitjacket or something, put them up on top of the scaffolding, open a trap door and drop them into the cold tub. It was designed to shock them, to bring them back to reality. It never seemed to work the first time. You'd always have to do it 3 and 4 and 5 times. A lot of documented cases, and in fact, at our hospital too, we didn't have one quite like that, but where there were broken arms and broken chins and stuff like that as they would fall through. These are a couple of the replicas that George had built for that display at East Hills. Go ahead. Talked about the cemetery. This is George Glore walking through the cemetery with a gal by the name of Louise Gillespie. Louise and her husband had gotten very interested in the state hospital cemeteries because there really wasn't a whole lot of documentation of who was where or stuff like that. Their son was a patient down at the Nevada hospital, and one day he ran off and ended up back in the cemetery, and they were called in to see if they could help find him, and they found him cowering behind a couple tombstones. But the place was a mess. And that's when they got excited or got involved in restoring the cemeteries, not only there, but at Fulton. The Farmington Hospital restored those in about 1998 or 9, and I went down for that, and the Gillespies were there too. But you can see George walking around through the cemetery. In the 60s, one of our superintendents said it was costing too much mowing between all the stones and around the stones and stuff like that, too much in gas and stuff. So he ordered all of the stones pushed over and buried. So when we say there's about 2,000 graves there, that's just a very educated guess. We thought there was originally like 1,700 and some odd. You can go on to the next slide, Sarah. We thought we had 1,700 graves that we could identify, starting with number 101. As we moved out, Department of Corrections wanted to clean all this brush out down there, and they found a double-digit stone, because they were numbered stones except for these 3 or 4 that are raised up here. But they were all numbered stones. And the conversation between the maintenance guy and I says, "You want us to look for the rest of them?" I said, "Lord, yes, if we can find them." So they started to dig. They found the first 100. So we thought our first burial was number 101. We eventually found number 1 through 100, and that's the ones you're seeing here. They kind of serpentine back and forth among the trees, and then eventually they move over to that big open field. This is all on Department of Corrections ground. Off of 36th Street, you'll see the monument on the left there. It says, "Lest we forget." It had the brass plaque made there because we thought our last burial was in 1943. Shortly thereafter, we had some woman called us because her mother was buried down there in 1946. That's what the death certificate said. Oops. So our health records people, who are just unbelievable, the amount of information they can find when they really get going on it. But they actually found that there's another 250 graves from 1943 to 1946. So between that and the 100 or so we found the first 100, so we're saying there's about 2,000 graves. It's kind of hard to tell for sure because we don't know just exactly where they are. We at one time had proposed a program to go out and try and identify at least where the rows were, so we could kind of get an idea of the approximate date. So if somebody was looking to see where their relative was buried, then we would have the ability to at least do that. that hasn't happened yet. There's a little parking lot off of 36th Street where you can get to the monument. We don't encourage people to go over to the stones here because that again, that's Department of Corrections ground, and they're very protective of it. Go ahead. The National Alliance on Mental Illness, and these figures are a little dated, but they say that 1 in 4 of us will suffer some form of psychiatric episode in their lifetime. And I used to tell the high school kids, that could be anywhere from mild depression, whenever the Chiefs lose, all the way up to the road rage type stuff. Sometimes the episodes are a lot more disastrous for them and their families. But on average, 1 in 4 of us will have something that we have to deal with, or that the family has to deal with. Back then, the total cost was about $300 billion. I can just imagine what it is now. One of the statistics that NAMI likes to throw around is that there is a more chance of survival and recovery from mental illness than there is, cancer, heart, lungs, the other stuff, because there's a hope that through treatment and now through the medications we're using, that we can make their lives a lot better than it was. Go ahead, Sarah. Part of the problem we have in brain science treating psychiatric patients is it's only been the last 25 years that we really kind of taken brain science to a new level. As if, for instance, Harvard and Stanford researchers were taking students, which is kind of scary, but they were taking students and they were putting them in some sort of a scanning device, and they were showing some pictures, the Eiffel Tower, the Grand Canyon, stuff like that. They showed them a picture they didn't know. They would explain it to them, and what they would find on the back brain scan there, you see the little red and yellow and blue area would start to glow. Well, that's fine. The afternoon, they bring them back in, show them the same pictures, and when they got to the place of the thing they didn't know that was explained to them, they saw the portion of the brain was starting to glow again. So what they were watching was a memory being made in the morning, and that memory was being duplicated in the afternoon. That was 2004 that they first saw that. It's no wonder that the patient histories back 50 years ago or 60 years ago, there just wasn't a whole lot of treatment going on. The first medication we had was introduced in 1954, and that was Thorazine, and that was to calm folks down. The classifications, the families of psychotropic medications have evolved over the years. The medications we have now are just unbelievably gentle. They don't have the side effects. The patients don't mind taking them. In fact, most of the patients understand everything that they're taking and can tell you why they have to take that. It's an educational process. But in the 70s, when we started to downsize, we would turn people loose with a bag full of pills and tell them just to have a good time. Our return rate back then was 58 or 59%. Since we started psych rehab and the processes we're using right now, our return rate is about 21 or 22%. The difference being we have to bring the patients back in to teach them a skill they need, or to adjust the meds or something like that, something very, very gentle. But then we can put them back out in the community. They get a whole lot better at home, or at least with their family support. And that's kind of pretty much the whole gist of what our treatment programs are. Go ahead, Sarah. We talk a lot about the dual hemispheres of the brain. It was 1981 when a doctor by the name of Johnson developed the theories that the two sides of the brain controlled the opposite sides of your human body. So if you are right-brained, it actually controls your left hand and your left leg and all that stuff. If you're left brain, it's the right-hand side. And I have a little thing I usually do with groups. I don't have time to do it right now. But it's just amazing to me, something as simple as that wasn't around, 30-some years ago. Go ahead. Most of our treatment programs now have evolved where they're not just the surgery, the psychosurgery. It's all evidence-based, where we have very specific credentials and testing and stuff like that. Again, we talk about the improved classes of psychotropic meds. Psychiatric rehabilitation was something we really endorsed at our place for a long time. And that's basically giving our patients the skills they needed to go home. Could be something as simple as brushing their teeth. It could be, how to work, how to get up and get ready to work skills. It could be just a variety of things, all with the idea of getting our guys and gals home. That's the main reason we are there. Some of the other treatment programs are CBT and DBT, dialectical behavior, and what that does is it's more of a behavioral type process. Not everybody qualifies for that, but there's other other processes, other treatments that we can use, and again, our success rate is just really, really strong now. Go ahead. In the 70s, again, when Dr. Brian O'Brien decided we needed to cut down, there was a national trend to downsize. A lot of our patients didn't belong at our type of facility, so a lot of the community-based programming took effect. There was alcohol and substance abuse programs were created for the community, suicide prevention, children and youth. Education is a big thing. The stigma that our patients undergo, because if they get if they're in school when they're young and they just don't behave or whatever it is, they get that little red flag behind their name, and that follows them through everything. So this stigma, this negative connotation of what's going on, is probably more dangerous to our patients than the rest of the things that are going on. Fortunately, we have places like Family Guidance here in Northwest Missouri that has a lot of these programs going here, and so it's more community-based. Go ahead. Couple exhibits that everybody seems to want to hear, and it used to be funny whenever we were on any TV show or something like that, and next few weeks or so, people walk in the front door and says, "Where's the torture devices?" Okay, second floor down the hall. But we also had some really interesting exhibits. There was a woman about 1910, I'm thinking, who complained about her stomach. X-rays didn't show a whole lot. It really wasn't the state of the art that it is now, but they operated on there and they found 1,446 things in her. Salt shaker lids, nuts, buttons, safety pins, thimbles, handles from spoons you see in the lower right-hand corners, nails, rocks, jewelry, just a variety of things. The pathologist who took this out of her decided to display it like that, which is really kind of neat. But anyway, we tend to, I don't say they champion things like this, but it just shows that it doesn't take much for us to have an illness, a behavioral problem that can expand to something like this. Go ahead, Sarah. This is another one, and we had a patient who wouldn't talk, but she would embroider her thoughts and poetry and lyrics from music and all that good stuff on here. At some point, after she would fill one up, staff would just throw it away and give her a new sheet or pillowcase or something like that and let her go at it. Fortunately, at some point, somebody thought George Glore needed to have this. You can sit there for hours and read some of the thoughts that she had embroidered here. There's a lot of Christmas lyrics, Christmas song lyrics. There's one, "Don't forget me." I don't have it. And anyway, "Don't forget me, please come and see me," that kind of stuff. There is something about the grapes. It's fascinating stuff, and this just showed how she manifested her symptoms into something for her that was just very, very therapeutic, I'm guessing. And I think Sarah had a team come in and do a evaluation of this, and I'm sorry I can't speak to more than that, but it's still up on the third floor. Go ahead. This is what our facility looks like now. Frederick is on towards the middle of the page there. We have 3 20-bed wings, 10 beds or 10 bedrooms on each one of the wings, or on each one of those flying part of the wings. The cottages to the right, there are 8 of those, or 6 of those with 8 beds each. The entire campus is surrounded by fence. We are a minimum security. Fulton Hospital has a maximum security and then it has a medium security. St. Louis Psych Rehab is a minimum security. We're a minimum security. The idea being that they go from the locked wards down to a cottage type situation, which could even mimic the group homes that they would be going to. So they do their own housekeeping, they fix their own meals, they, things like that. They work as a unit there. The administrative part is the other two sections there. But you can see how far we have changed, what our design, building design and stuff like that. We were built for 108 beds. We, at one time, were probably 10 or 12 beds over that. We've been fairly consistent with it now. Most of our patients are court referred to us. There's been a mental illness that's been exacerbated by something that has fallen into the law. They're either they're not guilty by reason of mental disease or defect, or they're incompetent. They can't help in their own defense. And we will see both of those. We have absolutely no voluntary commitments. Nobody can walk into our front door and say, I need a bed. Mosaic does that. They've got the unit there, but there's a wait list. At fewer than 1% of all the court cases in Missouri qualify as the NGRI, but there are still people in jail waiting for a bed to become available here. But again, my point is, you can just see how much things have changed. Okay, Sarah. And one last thing, I don't know if any of you have remember seeing One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. It was made in the 60s. Jack Nicholson played a prisoner who went from prison to a psychiatric hospital. Dean Brooks played his doctor. Dean Brooks is a psychiatrist. He was raised at Connally, Kansas, which is just south and west of Kansas City. And he even served at our hospital for a while, but he was eventually superintendent at the hospital in Oregon. The contracts were signed with the production company and Jack Nicholson and everything to have that filmed here. The St. Joe State Hospital was going to be the site for this. At some point, somebody got the idea that it just wasn't going to be very therapeutic. So they changed everything, and Dean Brooks heard about it and invited them up to his facility there. And in a couple of the scenes, if you would look over Dean Brooks' shoulder, he's talking to Jack Nicklaus, but you look over his shoulder, you can see the white buildings in the background with the steel bars on the windows and all that stuff. It could have been here, but it was actually theirs. And the fact that Dr. Brooks had a helping hand at our facility is just kind of a unique thing. I think that's the last slide, Sarah. Okay.
Scott, yeah, that was amazing. Do you have any other concluding thoughts?
Are you asking me, or are we asking the assembled crowd?
I'm asking you, Scott, before we move on to questions.
Okay. I think we, during my short period, the 10 years I was with them, with the museum, we had a lot of states who initially had said they had no interest in setting up exhibits like we have. They said it was just a black eye for them to do it. They just didn't want to rehash all this stuff for the patients' families, all this stuff. We always took the positive approach to anybody that came in the museum is, what you're seeing, we don't do now. Treatment works. Treatment is not like this. And if you have any questions, we'll be glad to hook you up with people. And again, there's a lot more community programs. A lot of the primary care doctors have a better feel for it now than they did not too long ago. They're not afraid to talk about this. They're not afraid to refer their patients for help. And again, yes, we do have the so-called torture devices, and yes, we do have a morgue, and we do have other things like that, but we've got a lot of uplifting things there that show that our patients have succeeded, and in fact, they're going home and becoming part of their community again, which I think is the main message for the museum.
Yeah, we do a lot of work at the museum to talk about breaking the stigma that surrounds the topic.
I can't hear you, Sarah.
Oh, sorry, I'll speak louder then. We do a lot of work at the museum that surrounds the topic of breaking the stigma that surrounds mental health, mental illness, and the work of George Glore and your work and the work of many, many people who worked at the state hospital and the patients that helped with the creating the GLOR is just really progressive and groundbreaking. And we're so fortunate to have it as a resource in St. Joseph today. Christina, can I ask you, have there been any comments or questions in the chat that we would like to pull up? And you're going to have to unmute yourself.
There are no questions, but people are just saying hi from all over.
Yeah, we did have somebody on Facebook that was joining us from Belgium, and we've also had people as far away as New York. So lots of people are joining us on Facebook as well as on the Zoom. So thank you all for joining us. If you have questions, you can type them in the comments on Facebook, or on the Zoom, you can type them in the chat, or if you wanted to raise your hands or unmute yourself to ask a question of Scott, please feel free to do so. We're going to open up to questions at this time. Christina, are you getting any questions?
No, not yet. I'm just asking if anybody had any questions. So.
Well, while they're developing their questions, Scott, I have several. So, so I intentionally kept the share screen up because you had so many great things. Well, and I know we talked earlier today, you had some pictures that I never have seen, and I thought I had seen them all. And this is one of them of George Glore. And I believe George's son, Michael, is on the Zoom as well. So hi, Michael. And if you wanted to jump on and say a few words, we would love to hear from you. But there's several pictures in your slideshow that I haven't seen, and hopefully we'll get copies of those at the museum. But I made some notes, and some of those are in the form of questions. This is one of them. This transorbital lobotomy display is not at the museum. Where is that? Do you know?
Not for sure. The Harvard University Med School Museum had the original Phineas Gage steel rod and the skull. They were trying to put it away. They decided they needed to take it off display a few years ago, and I called up there, was talking to some curator. I said, I'm Scott Clark with the Psychiatric Museum. Click, hung up on me. I called him back, I said, no, seriously. I mean, I really, we're a legitimate museum. Look us up, and I'll click. I mean, they just didn't believe we were real about that, or that we were legitimate enough. It's amazing to me. I imagine this was part of that Harvard display, and I can't tell you. I really don't know. There was in Iowa, one of the state hospitals there had a small exhibit, and I went up there because George had given them some of our materials, but they have one of Walter Freeman's pocket, almost like a pocket protector type thing, with 4 of those ice picks, and had his name on it. I would love to have gotten that. I'm thinking that there's just exhibits like this all over the country that people just, they don't want to talk about, or they have just been quiet for so long. Yes, I would like to know where some of those are.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
Scott, I think I've asked you this before. I just can't remember what you told me. I think I've asked about 20 years ago. I love the embroidered pieces, and I'm just curious. I think you told me that there were many, many, many of those, but they were thrown away. And I'm wondering, asking Sarah, how many are left? Do you know more history about them? And I also remember hearing the story. I photographed one of the pieces once, and the main area says "Make Heart a Wreck," and there's some embroidery that sort of talks about how he left her, she loved him. Yeah. And so I had heard the story was that she came to the hospital because she was engaged to be married, and her fiance didn't show up, and that's what had happened to her. And so I'm just curious, just more information and how many more are left. And
From what I understand, this is the one piece left. Staff before this happened would just take it, throw it away, and then give her a new piece. Yeah, can you imagine what we could have gotten from that? And yes, some of the lyrics, some of the heartfelt comments that she has written on there were just unbelievable. I mean, you can just imagine what type of pain she was going through.
there was one that was vertical that I photographed that I still have the photographs of. I photographed them in the original museum where you were, and we talked about it and you gave me permission to photograph it, but it does say make heart a wreck. And
Yeah.
I just, they're so sad, and they explain her pain so well, and they're so beautiful at the same time. Her colors, the designs of them, just how they turned out, or they were so natural, but they're so beautiful.
You know, a lot of the art, a lot of the patient art is just unbelievable too. And,
Yes.
and I didn't talk about Arthur Kraft or any of the other art we've got up there, but you just, of course, I can't draw a straight line, so I admire stuff like that. But some of our patients are just so talented when it comes to these things, and it's the only way they can really get their feelings out. And again, in this embroidery thing, every time I would go up to it, I'd find something new, some new phrase or some new lyrics, and I could just spend hours there. And I just imagine what the first ones were too.
Mm-hmm. I just wish that I could find out more information about. Does anybody know anyone that knew her or saw more of these or knew where they went or just anything? I just think it's my favorite part of the museum, of course.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure there are any left, because the story that George told me was all the rest of them had been pitched.
Yeah.
So anyway, but yeah, I imagine it's happening in other facilities too.
Sure.
It can't be just ours.
I can say we did have a group that came in and studied this piece intently, and that was back in 2012. They did the research right before I came to the museum, but it was released right as I was coming in as the GLOR interpretive planner. And they had interviewed, I believe, some staff that had known the patient. And the information that I remember from that was that she had been a patient at the state hospital for about 40 years. And she mostly didn't talk. I think they had her diagnosed as schizophrenic, but she could talk if she was very, very upset. She did not like to change, like if she had to change her room or something like that, then she would vocalize that she didn't like that. She would do these embroideries rather than talk. And really the embroideries are very much like sort of a snapshot of what the state hospital was like at that time and her feelings. And she's describing things that happened. And so like, if you look at this piece in the like sort of center to the left, the green part, there's like it says, what kind of cake will you have, white or chocolate?
Mm-hmm.
I'll take chocolate. What kind of drink, grape or strawberry? I'll take grape. Would you like a napkin? Yes, I would like a napkin. Thank you. She's talking about a cake and punch party that was at the state hospital. So she'll write about things that she was seeing and what was going on there. And when the state hospital was deinstitutionalized, they moved her from the state hospital into a nursing home. And the story that the researchers found was that she died shortly thereafter. And I think that makes very good sense. Somebody who had lived 40 years in an institution that was very averse to change, removing her from that state hospital and placing her in another place would have been a very disoriented experience for it. But as far as any others, this is the only one that I know of, though I have heard that many more were made.
Sarah, I'll send you the photograph of the one that I made of the vertical piece that says make heart erect, because I don't know where that isn't on this one. So,
This is a photograph of that same piece, the piece that's on display, but it's just this is a cropped photograph of a much larger piece.
okay, so maybe it's the same. Okay.
Michael Glore has a question.
Well, not actually a question. From what I remember on those embroidery panels, now you got a picture. I was pretty young. I was born in '68, so we're talking early '70s. But I swear I'd seen probably 3 of those panels. In the back of my mind, I think that something happened. There was water damage or something, because they weren't all displayed. They might have been gone. Of course, Dad's not around to ask anymore. But I do remember him specifically telling me that one of his bigger regrets in that was not latching on to every single panel that he could have found and saving all those. But there was so much stuff as he was assembling this, as what he could keep and what they couldn't keep at that point in time. Before he was titled Museum and Special Projects, that was actually my understanding there was kind of I hate to say disagreement, but they were trying to phase out his position, which was public relations in the hospital. And the people in the center office, for lack of a better term, Jefferson City, wanted to do away with that position. They wanted to retain Dad, so they made him Museum and Special Projects. And at that point, I know he was more focused on the museum in particular. If you don't mind, I've got an older photo that I could share to the group here.
I share and I'll let you share.
Sarah? Can you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely. Michael, go ahead and share your screen.
Okay, hang on just a minute.
Oh, wow.
That's me born in 1968. I'm going to say that's probably about 73-ish. And Dad started in Farmington, like you said, before he went on to Fulton. Mom actually had about 35 years in with the state hospital system, and she started in Farmington. And they came up to St. Joe before I was born in '68. I can't really tell you. I'm going to say about 65-ish, but that's an older photo.
That's great.
That's
Thanks.
neat, Mike. Yeah.
So Scott, we do have a question. Brenda Robertson wants to know from her husband, Bill Robertson, if you think being a football referee is good therapy.
Bill Robertson was our transportation director, and he and I refereed football together, high school, college football for, gosh, a long time. And yes, it was great therapy. Besides which, he and I could just tell some war stories when we got together. But yeah, Bill, yeah, he and his wife were both, in fact, they both worked there for a while. Just shows you can't hide around here, Sarah. Somebody's always going to bring up your past or something.
So if does anybody else have any questions for Scott? I have questions, but I'll give him those afterwards because they're mostly like, can I have that picture? I've never seen that before and it's really good. Okay, well, thank you so much, Scott. It's been a real honor to hear you talk. As always, you have forgotten more than I will ever know. And so I very much appreciate having you share with everyone, and we'll have this recorded forever now. So that's going to be a great resource too.
Well, this these types of things are fun. I miss this. I'm still getting my hand in it across the street. I retired 5 years ago, but I still am part of the new employee orientation. And one of that is an integral part on the history of the facility, that our staff actually is in at most recent of a long line of folks that have tried to help the community. So, yeah. And Sarah, you're doing a great job here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Scott. And thank you all.